Hello there you lot, time for another video. Today I'm taking a look back at the GTX 550 Ti, specifically the Asus DirectCu top version with 1GB of GDDR5 memory. The top version of the card comes as standard with a slightly higher clock speed than the regular DirectCu version does. It launched on May 19th, 2011 at a price of $169 US, $192 US today, adjusting for inflation, or around £151 or €172 at the time of writing. I bought it for only £15 at CEX in the UK, but the price has gone up a little to £18 on their website since I bought it, which still isn't too bad for the performance it can offer. On eBay.com it goes for around $35 US, not including shipping charges, although I think that may be for the regular DirectCu version with slightly lower clocks. Nothing an overclock can't fix though, mind you. Before we get on with the test, we better run through some of the specs first. The GTX 550 Ti was based on the Fermi 2.0 architecture and featured 1.17 billion transistors built on the 40nm fabrication process and had 4 streaming multiprocessors, 192 shading units, 32 texture mapping units and 24 raster operations pipelines. The DirectCu top version we have today ran at 975 MHz, with a shader clock of 1950 MHz. This one featured 1GB of GDDR5 memory on a 192-bit bus, running at 1026 MHz, or 4104 MHz effectively, due to the way GDDR5 memory works. It was a dual slot design card with a TDP of 116 watts and required one 6-pin PCIe power connector to run. It has support for up to DirectX 12, although it lacks support for a lot of its features, and also supported OpenGL 4.6 and OpenCL 1.1. Monitor output wise, it features one DVI, one HDMI and one VGA connector. The rest of the system we'll be using today features an i7 6700K overclocked to 4.8 GHz on all cores, a MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard, 16GB of DDR4 RAM overclocked to 2800 MHz, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. The operating system and games are also running from mechanical hard drives, so let's get on with the tests. First up for the 550 Ti is Grand Theft Auto 5, which released on the PC back in 2015. At 1080p, I managed to get high settings running with texture set to normal and with no anti-aliasing with the same settings at 720p as well, but both still had issues with quite noticeable lockups occasionally due to maxing out the 550 Ti's memory, but ran reasonably well at other points in the game, 720p especially. FPS throughout the city at 1080p dropped as low as 28 frames per second, but on occasion managed to get into the low 40s, whereas 720p managed as high as 75 frames per second. Despite the performance though, the lockups were significant. At 720p, the worst one lasted for nearly 5 seconds, with some more lasting 1 to 2 seconds. 1080p actually had less significant lockups though. But despite the issues, I decided to test at these settings as I didn't think the lockups happened often enough to make the game unplayable. Overall, both would run pretty well with some of the more memory consuming settings turned down a bit, but despite this I was surprised how well it did actually manage. 1080p managed benchmark figures of 36, 28 and 26 frames per second, for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with frequent but not that noticeable dips below 30 FPS in the desert area of the game. Other than the lockups, there were also a few spikes in frame times of around 60 to 100 milliseconds. 720p managed far better benchmark figures of 58, 43 and 39 frames per second, for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and other than the lockups, stayed well over 30 FPS throughout the test. Warframe was initially released back in 2013 and is available to download from the Warframe website or through Steam. I'm using the medium graphics preset with no anti-aliasing and depth of field and motion blur turned off. The game is kind of uncomfortable to play at 1080p, as throughout the test the game had a stuttery appearance, which caused some input lag as well, whereas 720p managed to run pretty smoothly. On the Landercraft, FPS dropped to around 40 frames per second at times at 1080p, but did manage to get up to 100 frames per second, depending on the camera angle and the location you're in on the ship. 1080p appeared stuttery here as well. 720p managed far better figures, with FPS hitting a max of over 200 frames per second. Both also had issues with fairly noticeable lockups and stuttering in Miru's Bazaar, but 720p's problems were less significant. During the mission itself, 1080p as mentioned was pretty uncomfortable to play at times due to the stuttery appearance, which only got worse in the most graphically intense scenes, with dips to as low as 27 frames per second, but highs of over 70 frames per second depending on the map location. You could improve this a bit with a reduction in settings though. 720p on the other hand ran pretty smoothly during the mission, but did show a slowdown in fire rate of the weapons on one occasion, which didn't actually happen at any other time. The input lag at 1080p was gone, and the frame rate would hit as high as 110 frames per second, and never really dropped below 60. 1080p managed 48, 28 and 23 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with very inconsistent frame times and multiple spikes in frame times of up to around 40 milliseconds. 720p though managed figures of 86, 53 and 45 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, far better than 1080p managed. It did however have multiple spikes in frame times of up to 40 milliseconds, and overall the frame times seemed inconsistent throughout, although these were noticeable. Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or Csgo for short, was initially released in 2012, and continues to be maintained and updated today. It ran so well on the 550 Ti that I didn't even bother testing 720p, as even at max settings at 1080p with no anti-aliasing, FPS was in the high 80s to nearly 190 frames per second, depending on the location of the map you were in. The 550 Ti had no issue at all with this game, and ran pretty smoothly throughout, with no signs of stuttering or locking up, so there isn't really much else to say about the performance. The benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 117, 70 and 62 frames per second respectively, and showed multiple spikes in frame times throughout of up to around 60 milliseconds, although these were unnoticeable. Rise of the Tomb Raider was just too much for the 550 Ti at 1080p, even with all the settings turned off or as low as they could go with DirectX 11 mode enabled. Straight away I noticed a lot of input lag, which made combat and any precise movement more difficult. 720p though shows a huge improvement with no input lag at all, and FPS peaking in the low 50s at the start of the test. It could even still run well if you increase some of the settings as well. It was pretty jarring at times at 1080p due to the game having a stuttery sort of appearance, which 720p didn't seem to have. In the Soviet installation, 1080p drops into the mid-20s to around 37 FPS range, and sits around 25 FPS quite a lot. But 720p even hit 62 frames per second at one point here, and didn't really drop below the low 30s at all throughout the test, and was actually quite playable. 1080p showed 27, 18 and 17 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates, and had spikes in frame times of around 65 to 140 milliseconds. Parts of the game were kind of playable, but overall I wouldn't recommend it at all. 720p though fared far better with average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 46, 32 and 29 FPS respectively. Despite how smoothly it ran, there were still some spikes in frame times of around 45 to 80 milliseconds, although I didn't really notice them anyway. With overclocking, using MSI Afterburner, the voltage was upped slightly to 1.175 volts, and I manually set 50% fan speed as well to keep the card cool. I also want to point out that Windows 10 in its infinite wisdom forced installed some updates before I started the overclocked testing, so performance may vary slightly. With the small increase in voltage, the 550 Ti managed a stable clock in games of 1040 MHz in all of the games I tested, up from 975 MHz. This put the shader clock up to 2079 MHz as well. The memory managed 1262.5 MHz, which shows us 2525 MHz in MSI Afterburner, or 5050 MHz effectively, in all of the games other than Rise of the Tomb Raider, in which it needed a drop to 1257.5 MHz, 2515 MHz in Afterburner, or 5050 MHz effectively to be stable. The overclock couldn't make much of a difference to performance at 1080p, other than reduce the severity of the lockups at stock, which still happened at points throughout the test. FPS in the city at 1080p was around the low 30s, up into the mid 40s in parts at 1080p, and 720p even manages to hit 80 frames per second at one point too, although there were still some noticeable lockups at 1080p, and one that occurred in the city during the test at 720p as well. The lockups throughout at this resolution were mostly gone compared to stock clocks, but there were still some noticeable but brief lockups in both tests, and one fairly significant one at 720p on the way to the desert. Both resolutions also showed very little stuttering as well. so a slight reduction in some of the more memory-intensive settings would make the game perfectly enjoyable at either resolution, although 720p is quite noticeably smoother despite the lockups. The benchmark shows average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 38, 28 and 26 frames per second respectively, near identical to stock. There were still some spikes in frame time throughout of around 40 to 60 milliseconds, but these were less than at stock. 720p showed 62, 46 and 42 frames per second, for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, which is a minor improvement over stock clocks. There was also only one spike in frame times of around 180 milliseconds throughout the test, discounting the lockups that happened. Warframe at 1080p with stock clocks had a sort of stuttery appearance, which also caused input lag throughout the test, but the overclock managed to do away with this. There was, however, still a noticeable stutter in intense scenes during the test, with dips to 27 FPS happening again. It did though also manage to get up to 80 frames per second depending on your location in the map. 720p showed a fairly decent improvement, with FPS now between the high 70s up to nearly 150 frames per second in the lesser detailed areas of the map, but did drop to 54 frames per second at one point. The improvement in 1080p's stuttery appearance was also apparent on the lander craft as well, with FPS now getting up to 115 frames per second at points depending on the camera angle and your location on the ship. And 720p could now also hit up to 250 frames per second here too, again entirely dependent on where you are and where the camera is pointing. Both resolutions still had brief but noticeable lockups in Miru's Bazaar as well. The benchmark at 1080p showed 52, 31 and 24 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and dipped below 30 frames per second quite a bit throughout the test according to the frame times, with multiple spikes throughout of around 40 to 60 milliseconds. 720p though showed a fairly reasonable improvement over stock clocks, with figures of 99, 59 and 49 frames per second, for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with no notable spikes in frame times at all, and plenty of space to increase the settings here too. With Csgo, any improvement here was going to be pretty unnoticeable other than in the benchmark, as the performance even at max settings was already great at stock clocks. FPS was now hitting nearly 200 in places, up from a max of around 186 frames per second at stock clocks. There was a small improvement in benchmark figures as you can see, with average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 121, 72 and 62 frames per second respectively, and there were still spikes in frame times of around 40 to 100 milliseconds, although like stock clocks these were unnoticeable. Lastly, before we finish up for today, is back to Lara Croft with Rise of the Tomb Raider. As I mentioned back in the overclocking section, the 550 Ti was unstable with the memory clock at 1262.5 MHz, 2525 MHz in MSI Afterburner, or 5050 MHz effectively, but was stable with a reduction to 1257.5 MHz, 2515 MHz in MSI Afterburner, or 5030 MHz effectively. At 1080p, the frame rate, which is still under 30 FPS quite a bit, still has an impact on combat, although not as much as it did at stock, which was nice to see, and the input lag was reduced a fair bit too, with only one noticeable occasion of it happening. It was however still quite jarring at points of the game, and 720p though, much like at stock, ran pretty smoothly, with FPS even hitting over 60 at the start of the test. It did however show some slight stutter at points, which I'll get into in a bit. Throughout the Soviet installation, FPS was pretty much the same at 1080p. In fact, it was the exact same, with lows of 25 and highs of 37 frames per second. 720p on the other hand actually hit 70 FPS at one point here, although to be fair, that was while standing still, talking to one of the characters. In the copper mill, 1080p still dropped to nearly 20 FPS, and never tended to get above 40, but did spike up to 50 at one point. 720p though got between the low 30s up to the mid 70s here, and did in fact show some micro stutter in the copper mill. Like at stock, there's space to up the settings more, but the more intensive settings may cause the game to dip below 30 in the most intense scenes of the game. 1080p managed 30, 20 and 18 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. There were also spikes in frame times reaching nearly 60 milliseconds, with some around 100 to 200 milliseconds and one lasting a fraction over 1 second. 720p's benchmark figures weren't much different to stock either, with average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 50, 34 and 29 FPS respectively. There were some spikes of around 40 to 60 milliseconds, which weren't noticeable, but as a slight increase in average and 1% low frame rates indicate, there were higher frame rates throughout compared to stock clocks. Overall, I was actually extremely impressed with how well the 550 Ti performed, especially in GTA 5, which only ran into problems because of the 1GB of memory being maxed out. There are versions of the 550 Ti with more memory though which would fix this, but you can also reduce the more memory intensive settings if you'd like. Csgo, I was kind of expecting to perform really well, as it has performed perfectly fine on lower end hardware than the 550 Ti. Warframe also ran quite well, at least at 720p, as 1080p was pretty uncomfortable to play. The overclock made a huge improvement on this though. Rise of the Tomb Raider, I'd only recommend 720p or slightly higher at the most, as 1080p with and without an overclock had issues with the frame rate making combat a bit more difficult than it needs to be. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon, patreon.com/Benching&Gaming, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Benching&Gaming. So thanks again for watching, it means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.